Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this pioneering version, debut of podcast that's going to be covering lots of interesting subjects, and among them, legal issues, speaking, discussions, books, and things that we generally encounter in our day-to-day lived experiences. And so, um, I'm going to be talking about three or four subjects which I documented in books. One is the modern day slavery, um, concerning specifically African workers in the Middle East and China, and whether there's a need for a globalized United Nations led response. And this is really a synopsis of the issue, from official reports, media reports, and most importantly, it will be just an overview of the legal framework. So it's a collection of some of the associated materials on this subject. The disclaimer here: it's not assumed or intended in any way for the collected material to be owned or claimed to be or pass as the original work of the compiling person, i.e., the author of the specific edition of the book. Rather, it's a form of putting together a reference point on the subject for public use by researchers and other interested parties. And the material is left in its original form. So, just as a general overview, throughout human history, mankind has migrated either for better or for worse. And in case of the current issue, just like other parts of the world, African men and women travel to the Middle East and China as visitors, entrepreneurs, or work. And in the recent months and years in the Middle East, right in the middle of a global pandemic, these some of the issues, the traumatic human rights violations, have laid bare the abuse, exploitation, and in some reported cases, worse. So the degree of seriousness varies from from one country to the other. Um, for example, in the case of Ethiopians, it's mainly in Lebanon, uh, and in some cases, in the case of Kenyans and Ugandans, it's countries like Saudi Arabia, um, and other Middle Eastern countries, and for example, Emirates. And the issue, admittedly, is an intricate, complex, and multifaceted one, and it's fluid, and it's intersection in the sense that it involves obviously individual choices, but also it encompasses the wider issues around the economic um, settings, the political settings, and the overall social issues that sort of make it imperative, almost inevitably, for especially usually in the case of the Middle East, young women and men who work in domestic settings that make it impossible for them to thrive in their own countries, even though most of them got qualifications, but to go and put up with human rights violations, in some cases torture, and losses of life. So I'll just quickly go through the legal framework of the issues involved. They, of course, the NGOs and other independent reports and media reports, but the focus in this initial aspect will be just an overview of the legal framework. So some of the aspects of the legal framework are, for example, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of the Family, which was adopted by the General Assembly Resolution 4548 on December 1990. The ISAD, which stands for International Convention on the Elimination of Forms of Racial Discrimination, which China ratified in 1981. The United Nations Expert Committee that monitors state compliance with the ISAD, and ISAD has specifically called on governments, and I quote, to fully implement legislation and other measures already in place to ensure that people of African descent are not discriminated against. Furthermore, there is a slavery convention which was adopted in September 26 by the League of Nations. I think it's under Treaty Series Volume 60, and you can find on page 253 rather. There's the Forced Labor Convention in June 1930 by the International Labour Organization, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in Paris on December 1948. There's also the Slavery Convention, as I think I briefly mentioned earlier, December 1953, and it's under Treaty Series Volume 212, page 17. There's another complementary convention on the abolition of slavery, slave trade, and institution and practices to slavery, 1956, and the convention concerning brackets number 105, the abolition of forced labor in June 1957, and it's under Treaty Series Volume 320, page 21. And there's a convention on consent to marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriages, referred to in December 1962, under Treaty Series Volume 52, page 231. There's a whole raft of other conventions, legislation, and I'll quickly go through them, that could be used, by the way, creatively to counter this vice. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, December 1979. The Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the permanent, the other one is the Protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labor Convention of 1930, again June 2014, and by the International Labour Organization. And there's the protocol also to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which supplements the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. I mean, that is just sort of a brief summary of some of the legislation that can be used to counter, challenge, mitigate, remedy what is clearly modern day slavery that acutely, disproportionately impacts people of African descent based in the Middle East, and in some cases, as we had during the pandemic, China. Now, some of the jurisdiction or the sort of the institution that have jurisdiction over this, among others, for example, the Permanent Court of Arbitration. For example, in the case of Muscat Dawes case, brackets France via the United Kingdom, and there's a partial award after the case was heard, as a sort of the main sort of gist of that case. The International Court of Justice, for example, the case of Barcelona Traction Light and Power Company Limited. It was Belgium versus Spain. The ICJ reports 1970, page 3. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the case of Krunerak et al. And the judgment of February 2001 in the trial chamber T9623. That's the reference, and IT 9623/1 IT. That's it, relates to the case. Again, there's another case under the same tribunal, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, where there's a judgment in June 2003 in the appeals chamber. We also have European Court of Human Rights as part of that jurisdiction. One of the examples of the case of Siladin versus France, court number 73316/01, judgment July 2005. The Community Court of the Economic Community of West African States, and the case of Hajatu Mani Korao versus Republic of Niger, and I think it's case number ECW. Judgment was ECWJ/JUT/0608, and the judgment was in October 2008. And last but not least, again, the European Court of Human Rights in the case of Ranci versus Cyprus and Russia, Cyprus and Russia, and the case number 2596504/04, judgment in January 2010. And lastly, among the summarizing some of the jurisdictional references is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the case of workers of Hacienda Brazil, VAD versus Brazil, and its series C number 318, judgment October 2016. So that summarizes the jurisdiction. I'll just briefly mention some of the relevant documents related to this issue. There's a report on the International Commission of Inquiry into the existence of slavery and forced labor in the Republic of Liberia, Monrovia. That was September 1930. Goes back that long. There's some notes on the terms of reference on the Ad Hoc Committee on Slavery by the United Nations Economic and Social Council, 1950. The other reports, such as the one from session on the Committee on Slavery and Economic Social Council, 1950. There are a number of reports which I all can't go into right now in the interest of time, but there are special rapporteurs on abolishing slavery and its contemporary forms by Hans Engen, 1955, and Muhammad Awad, 1966. And last but not least, which is one of the things I'm going to mention, there's a report submitted by the Secretary General pursuant to Resolution 388 of the Economic and Social Council of September 1951, slavery, slave trade, and other forms of servitude, January 1953. And lastly, is the Bellagio Harvard Guidelines on the Legal Parameters of Slavery Research Network on the Legal Parameters of Slavery, March 2012. And so that is really covers some of the legal angle, as really in a brief view on the issues. But I think what is evident is, despite the existence of such extensive legislation and documentation and reports, organizations like the International IOM, the International Organization for Migration, Amnesty International, media houses, and other reports in the media in Africa, countries like Uganda, Kenya, the associated, other media houses, there really hasn't been any sort of fruitful action. to tackle this issue. We know individual countries, for example, Nigeria, have sought to deal with it in a sort of a smaller way by repatriating their citizens, but there is no coordinated efforts led by the UN, for example, to tackle this issue. And sadly, this has a direct correlation to the continuing torture, abuse, misuse, and in some cases losses of life to these young men and women who are there trying to earn a living as workers. And so that is what this publication by myself, which is entitled Modern Day Slavery, Workers Not Slaves, Modern Day Slavery, Labor Export and Racism, African Workers in the Middle East, China, a need for a harmonized global United Nations-led response. It's on online, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all other forms, all other media outlets, retail outlets, and it's by Esquire, Shane Esquire, so you can look it up. But I hope to have a more detailed discussion on the issue soon. So for now, we're going to a short break, and we'll come back with similar discussion within the same realm of the subject, that's human rights, but on housing, gentrification, and the Magnitsky Act. Thank you, and speak to you soon. Thank you.